Hello, my name is Ebony Love, and I am joined by the Honorable Henry Lee Adams. Today is Tuesday, July 23rd, 2023, and we are in Judge Adams' chambers located at the Brian J. Simpson United States Courthouse in Jacksonville, Florida. To begin, can you please state your full name and say when and where you were born?
My name is Henry Lee Adams Jr. I was born in Jacksonville about 78 years ago.
And to begin, you've given multiple interviews, and I don't want to kind of revisit some of those themes that were brought up because we can find those in other places. But I did listen to your interview that was featured in Conversations on Catfish, Courtrooms, and Change. And in it, you mentioned that ever since high school, you knew that you wanted to be an attorney. What is your first memory of the legal profession that inspired you to want to be an attorney?
The first memory of, my first memory is reading an article in what was then the Florida Star newspaper, which was a black newspaper in Jacksonville, and the only black newspaper in Jacksonville. The other newspaper had a black section, but it did not deal with some of the issues that took place. And it was, if I remember correctly, a lawsuit that had been filed by Ernest Jackson, who I knew of was a black lawyer, against the city of Jacksonville regarding the public swimming pools. The city had one black swimming pool, and most of the communities other communities had swimming pools in that community. So and I was in high school when I read this article, and I also had to walk from East Jacksonville to Jefferson Street in Jacksonville, which is in West Jacksonville, to go to the swimming pool. You know, a group of us, we get together and, during the summer when school is out and go there to swim. And across the street from the black swimming pool, or I should say colored swimming pool, was a very large round swimming pool for whites. And you know, it bothered me that I had to walk by that one to get to ours, which was usually overcrowded. You'd have to wait there for an hour to get in the pool. So that was my first memory was of Ernest Jackson filing that lawsuit to desegregate the swimming pools. There was a golf course that was included in it also. And it was impressive. I was impressed by the fact that black lawyers could do that. And after that, I read, I think it was when Dr. King was arrested in St. Augustine, and Earl Johnson petitioned the court here, and he was brought up here to be released. It was impressive. It was impressive seeing black lawyers making a contribution and doing. I didn't know any of them personally. Never thought I did, but that impressed me quite a bit. That's what I wanted to do because I had given some thought to teaching, which was the job for most blacks with a college degree. Not that I was confident I'd get a college degree at that point in time, or working at the Naval Air Station as a colored employee, or working at the post office as a colored employee. And you know, all of these colored employees, they were making less than what their white co-workers were making, and there was no job guarantee to that. And I had ruled out myself doing all of that. So I guess college became automatic at that point in time. And a lawyer was what I wanted to do. I wanted to be like respect those guys.
And so you graduated from Matthew Gilbert High School, and I've noticed that a lot of people who graduate high school in Jacksonville end up going to Tallahassee, Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University.
FAMU.
Yes, FAMU for short. Was there a reason why you chose FAMU opposed to other HBCUs in the state?
My sister was there.
Mm-hmm.
She was 1 year ahead of me in school, and she was there. I didn't select the school. My mother and my sister selected the school, and that was the reason that I ended up. I can't say that's the reason I ended up at A&M, but the only other school I knew about was Edward Waters, and my mother canceled that for some reason. I think it had to do where it was located in Jacksonville. Mm-hmm. And then there was Florida Normal, which at the time was in St. Augustine, and I had been there before. I think in high school we did a thing up there, but I didn't want to go there either. So, and they were about to close the school down. The school was having, I think, some major financial issues, and it was about to be moved to Miami, and I think it's doing well in Miami now.
And that's Florida Memorial University.
Florida Memorial, yeah. We used to call it Florida Normal.
Yeah, because it taught teachers.
Yeah.
And what year did you graduate high school?
62.
Okay. In one of your previous interviews, you did mention that at FAMU you were learning more about federal cases and kind of how they were influencing society at large. So we've already talked about the lawsuits here in Jacksonville and how Ernest Jackson was trying to
Earl Johnson and Leandy Shaw.
And they were trying to desegregate society here in Jacksonville. But when you were at FAMU, can you kind of talk about what cases you were looking at and what the student body were looking at while you were in undergrad?
Well, let me say this, that the cases that I talked about when I was in high school did not come to a conclusion until I was in college. Mm-hmm. And that was in 62. I think the Civil Rights Act came out in 64. So at some point, some of them became moot as a result of the Civil Rights Act. Brown versus Board of Education by the time I went to college, Brown versus Board of Education didn't do anything in Jacksonville, just like it didn't exist. Now where was I going? But I recall the desegregation of the swimming pool. They closed it. The desegregation of the golf course, they closed it. And the parks that was a part of that lawsuit too. There was a basketball park, maybe a block or two away from the swimming pool. This was a segregated park. There was no black basketball park, and I think they closed it, but they did plant roses where it used to be, and that happened while I was in college. But when I got to A&M, there were 800 students demonstrating at the Greyhound bus station, at the train station and the Greyhound bus station. And that was life at Florida A&M for the next 3 or 4 years. I remembered Earl Johnson coming up to represent a group of the students. I remember Tobias Simon out of Miami coming up to represent the students, and what was the lawyer's name? A black lawyer out of Pensacola. In fact, his son sits on the 11th Circuit now. I think he's the only black person on the 11th Circuit.
There's two now. Nancy Abudu was confirmed.
Okay, yeah.
But Charles Wilson is the...
Chuck Wilson.
Okay.
Chuck Wilson's dad, before they moved to Tampa. Mm-hmm. I remember them. He and Mr. Wilson was one busy fellow. Mm-hmm. He was up there quite often in court representing students that that were arrested. That was quite influential to me also. Um, Florida A&M had a law school, and my plan was to get into Florida A&M's law school. My mother wanted me to go do 4 years, come out, get me a job teaching, and then save some money and go to law school, because she couldn't handle that. I don't think she could handle that for 7 years. But my senior year at A&M, they shut the law school down and opened Florida State's law school. I think Arthenia Joyner, I don't know if you know her. Arthenia was a state senator out of Tampa, black lady who graduated from A&M and A&M Law School. She was the last student to be admitted to that law school. And my buddy and I thought we could squeeze the dean into doing that. But it was done.
And that was my next question, was how and why did you choose Howard? But I guess it was kind of obvious with FAMU law closing.
Yeah.
That was Howard your only option?
No, FSU was my option too, but I did not want to be in the first class at this FSU's law school.
So you could have applied to FSU?
I did apply to it.
Okay.
But I mean, we had a bad relationship. The students at FSU and A&M, I mean, you know, they were telling us at A&M, do not go through that campus. If you've got to go over to the black section of town, get you a bus and go over there. So it was that type of situation. So FSU was out, and I applied to Howard also. And Howard had scholarship money. I mean, at that point in time, it was less than, I think the percentage of lawyers in the country was less than 1%. Less than 1% of the lawyers in the United States were black. And I think the Ford Foundation had funded quite a few scholarships at that point in time.
And what was it like going to Howard for law school?
It was a different world. I had been to, like I said, I lived my life in Jacksonville. Then I went to Tallahassee, which was no better than Jacksonville. I think we called it train to Tallahassee. We left Jacksonville at the segregated section of the Union Station. The train stopped in Lake City, and we had to go into the colored section to get a sandwich or water or use the bathroom. And the same thing at Tallahassee, which is why the demonstrations were going on. But it was different in D.C. It was big, it was crowded. Compared to Jacksonville, D.C. was a big place. Two, it had a lot of influential black people in D.C. And it was just physically different. The first place I stayed was the YMCA. I had a roommate from New York. He graduated from A&M with me, and we were going up together. And we stayed there until we could find a place to stay. And then we got a place in this house in the northwest section, not that far from Howard. If we had to walk to Howard, we could do it, but it was easier to get a bus and go to Howard, and you didn't have to worry about being transported on the back of the bus. Mm-hmm. That was not an issue up there. It was an issue in Jacksonville. So it was different. And I guess 3 blocks from my house, there was a commercial district that had a JCPenney's, all sorts of things up there, and I couldn't believe this. JCPenney was downtown Jacksonville, and that was it. So it was a different place.
And so you've graduated Howard, and again, another interview explains how you got the Reggie program
Yeah.
fellowship, and you, long story short, you ended up back in Jacksonville.
I ended up back in Jackson.
And it was 1969 when you came back?
69, yeah.
And you ended up with the public defender's office.
No, I ended up with legal services. I was assigned as original Heber Smith fellow to Jacksonville. I think it was Duval County Legal Aid then.
And then, so how did you transfer from legal aid into being a public defender?
How did I do it?
Yes.
Well, I stayed in, I stayed at legal services, legal aid for about a year. And I really was, the Reginald Heber Smith program was designed to assist some of the legal services in doing non-legal service type legal work, which at the time was anything but divorces and things of that nature. But Jacksonville didn't know that section, and I ended up doing divorces. I think I handled a Title VII case, and they couldn't beat me in court, so they called my boss and said I shouldn't be doing that because I'm representing these people who work at the post office, and they make too much money to be getting legal, like that. And so I was there for about a year, and then one of the lawyers that I had met, and I think it was about 6 black lawyers in the city then, he was working part-time at the public defender's office, and he said he thought I could get in over there, which is really what I wanted to. I wanted to get some trial experience, and boy did I get it. So I applied for a position. I went over and talked to him, and talked to the public defender, who was Lou Frost at the time, was a good guy, and I got a position over there.
And when you started, how old was the office when you started?
How old was the public defender's office? That is a real good question. Lou Frost was the second public defender.
And the reason I ask is because Gideon versus Wainwright was decided in 1963. And so public defender offices...
It was about 5 years old.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the first black public defender, the first black assistant public defender was Leander Shaw. Mm-hmm. He worked for Ed Austin, who after I believe a couple of years as a public defender, as the public defender, he went to become the state attorney, and Leander went with him. And Lou Frost got the position, and so that's how that kind of came out.
And so you mentioned earlier that when you were growing up, Earl Johnson and Ernest Jackson were 2 attorneys that you had looked up to. Do you know how public defense worked prior to the public defender's office being established?
I don't think there was. I think maybe I think a judge could prevail to get a private lawyer to represent some person who couldn't afford a lawyer and needed a lawyer. I think that's how I did, and I remember seeing the Gideon versus Wainwright movie. I think it was Henry Fonda. That's how he ended up with a lawyer, and then some clerk at the Supreme Court decided that this is a really interesting issue, and they got somebody who had already been on the Supreme Court but was off at that point in time. I think that's how it went. His lawyer was a former member of the Supreme Court.
Okay, I don't know exactly Gideon versus Wainwright, but I just thought that it was interesting that you were starting with the public defender's office here in Jacksonville kind of soon when that decision had come out.
No, it was after that decision.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And you had just mentioned that there were 6 black attorneys who were practicing in Jacksonville
Yeah.
around the time. Can you kind of describe that relationship, and do you remember any of their names?
We had Earl Johnson, Ernest Jackson, Leander Shaw, boy, if he was alive today, he'd curse me out. He was the first black United States magistrate in the state of Florida. He was the first black person elected to a statewide position in the state of Florida. He was elected to the Florida Supreme Court. Joe Hatcher.
Yes.
Joe was here. Joe was here. I got pictures of them, but names are escaping me. Rutherford McGriff was still practicing. Gerardo was still practicing. And I think Gerardo was working for, well, he wasn't practicing, he was working for, I believe, the Federal Small Business Administration. Reese Marshall. Reese was practicing with Earl Johnson at that point in time. And Reese was the guy who got me into the association with the black lawyers. His being the youngest of them. And a couple of more guys that I don't remember now.
And did you look to the other attorneys as mentors, or how did y'all work together?
We worked well together. We'd help each other out. Jennings Best is also one of the guys. And then I said that, since you asked that question, Jennings Best was one of those kind of papa guys. I mean, if you called him, he'd walk you through it, and he was happy to do it. You didn't waste his time. He was just a nice guy who did that for us. But all of the older guys would help out if you needed their help or their advice. So we worked well. We fought like dogs sometimes, but we worked well together.
And so just transitioning a little bit into your judicial experience, you were the first black judge in the 4th Judicial Circuit here in Florida. When you're the first, you're also the only. So how was that experience when you were on the bench in state court?
Well, it was I don't know how I would describe it other than to say it was being the first black judge in a very conservative district with a very conservative court. And as I say that, and I say it reluctantly, because there were some judges on that bench that, if I needed help, would freely and voluntarily help me with things, like Major Harden. I think Major went to the Florida Supreme Court years too. I hate to start calling names. Susan Black. But there were quite a few older guys who were, I would say, racist. And I was there to watch that whole thing change. I mean, with new judges, younger judges, I think it changed. I think it's a pretty good court. I believe so now.
And so there are some people who might listen to this interview, and we're about to get into your experience on the federal bench. For someone who has no idea what you do, can you explain the difference between sitting on a state court bench and a federal bench?
Well, the jurisdiction, your ability to do anything is pretty limited in federal court. It involves laws passed by Congress. It involves interpretation of the United States Constitution to given situations. And under certain circumstances, it involves enforcing or acting under state law and issues of diversity and things of that nature. So it has a smaller caseload, much smaller caseload than the federal court has a much smaller caseload than the state court. As we can tell by the difference in the numbers of judges. I guess you got 40 circuit judges or trial judges in the 4th Judicial Circuit now. And we got, we got 3 active judges in the Middle District of Florida, Jacksonville Division, other than myself, and I'm retired legally, and Judge Schlesinger, who's also retired. So that tells you the type of difference in what we do. I would imagine that the 4th Judicial Circuit has 10 times more criminal cases than we have. So.
And what does it mean to you to have sat on both or either the state court or federal bench here in Jacksonville, where you're from?
Well, I'm glad. I'm absolutely glad. I was on the the state court. I was there, I think, for about 12 or 14 years, and it gave me the confidence that I could do this job, and it helped me understand how judges should do the job. Then I went to Tampa when I was appointed on the federal court. My first 6, 7 years I spent in Tampa, struggling to get back home. And I think I was able to function and do a reasonably good job there as a result of having that experience in the state court. I hope that answers that.
It does. What case is your most memorable case?
You know, I'm always asked that, and I think every time I'm asked that, it depends on my frame of mind. I throw out different cases, so I don't, you know, it's hard to answer that question. Well, the most memorable case I've had, I don't know how to answer that.
It's okay.
Yeah.
If you were looking at yourself when you were graduating high school, what would you tell an aspiring attorney who's graduating high school? What advice would you give them?
Well, that would depends on being an attorney. What type of attorney he wanted to be? What did he want to do with being an attorney? Did he want to find a position in some corporation that needed the legal raising or training? That's one issue. But for most of the folks that I knew wanted to go to lawyer, wanted to be a lawyer. They wanted to be a trial lawyer or have the experience of performing trials. And my suggestion to them would be to jump in the state attorney's office or the public defender's office, get that started, and then decide how you want to do it.
I have 2 more questions and then
Okay,
we'll
sure.
be done. When you were an undergrad at FAMU, you were talking about some of the student protests and kind of how they related to current litigation and current issues in the courts at the time. In the past 3 years, we've kind of seen an explosion of similar protests. Do you have any insight about the relationship between protests and changes within the legal system, whether it's effective or any insight that you have to share.
I think, but for the student demonstrations of the late 50s and the 60s, as a black citizen, I don't think we would have reached what we reached as fast as we did it, if that makes any sense to you. Without that demonstration, without those kids getting on those buses and going south and marching and taking the abuse that they did, we'd be in big trouble.
Thank you. And so, in an interview with the Florida Times Union about your taking senior status, you had reflected on your appointment at the state court bench, and you had said, quote, "It's a great feeling. I kind of cracked the door. The day is rapidly approaching when it won't be uncommon to see black faces and black robes," end quote. How do you feel about that prediction that you had made before taking the state court bench?
Well, it did have the effect of us being able to see other black faces in the courts. It's been slow. It's too slow, but I don't think anybody is shocked or surprised to see a black judge, female or male. So I feel pretty good about it. I feel pretty good that if my being appointed and sitting had an effect to encourage other people, other black lawyers to do it, then that was successful. It's just not as fast as it should have been.
I know I said 2 more questions, but you actually just inspired one more. Earlier in the interview, you said that at the time that you were considering going to law school, that less than 1% of attorneys in the United States were black. Today, less than 5% of attorneys in the United States are black.
I read that.
And that number has been going down over the past decade. What reflections do you have related to that statistic? I don't know.
That the number is going down?
That the number is going down, that there aren't as many black attorneys as is represented in the United States population. What are your reflections just generally?
I would say that the government had the opportunity to appoint the cream of the black crop as judges. I'm not saying I'm in that position, but now the law firms are picking the cream of the crop. The corporations are picking the cream of the crop, and the lawyers, the black lawyers, are able to put together pretty decent law firms. I'm not saying that. I am saying there are not enough black lawyers. That's still an issue. But I think that's why the number is dropping, because the law firms and the companies and the corporations have selected more lawyers than ever before. And so we don't have that large available. And there are a lot of lawyers who don't want to be a judge. And I can understand that also.
Is there anything I didn't ask you about that you would like to share?
Sounds like you covered everything.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time today.
Sir. It's good to meet you too.
Nice to meet you as well.